Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live a life untouched? I don't mean untouched by love or untouched by experience. I mean untouched by the noise, untouched by the chaos, untouched by every rude comment, every silent rejection, every judgmental glance that stings long after it's gone. Imagine this for a moment. Someone says something cruel. They frown, they ignore you, they gossip. And instead of feeling your heart sink, your mind spiral, your chest tighten. You feel still. You feel grounded, calm, unmoved, like a mountain in a passing storm. Because here's the truth. Most people go through life like emotional puppets. Strings pulled by opinions, expectations, disappointments. Dancing unconsciously to the rhythm of other people's moods. Someone approves, we smile. They disapprove, we crumble. They don't respond, we obsess. We become prisoners of reactions we never chose. But what if I told you there's another way? A path walked by sages, monks, and ordinary seekers like you and me. A path the Buddha himself laid out over 2,500 years ago. Not in temples of gold, but in silence, awareness, and deep, unwavering stillness. He once said, "You will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger." Let that sink in, not for your fear, not for your attachments, but by them. We suffer not because life hurts us, but because we grip it too tightly. We react too quickly. We care about too many things that don't actually matter. And slowly, without realizing it, we become tired. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Like we're carrying 1,000 invisible ropes, each one tugging us in a different direction. A friend's opinion here, a family expectation there, social media, comparison, guilt, regret, fear. But no one tells you. You are allowed to let go. You're allowed to stop dancing for their approval, to stop defending your worth, to stop chasing storms and gripping clouds. You don't need to fix the chaos. You only need to stop stirring it. What if, from this day forward, you gave yourself permission to be still, not cold, not distant, but still, like a deep, calm lake that reflects truth without distortion? What would that kind of peace feel like in your body, in your mind, in your breath, you might think? Is that even possible for me? And the answer, yes, it is, not by adding more to your life, but by subtracting everything that doesn't belong. Because peace is not something you chase. It's what rises naturally when you stop clinging to everything that isn't you. In the teachings of Zen, they say, let go or be dragged. And perhaps you've been dragged long enough, dragged by the weight of others' expectations, dragged by the noise of the world that never stops demanding, dragged by stories you never questioned but always believed. But here's the invitation. Not to escape the world, but to rise above it. To step into the stillness that has always been waiting for you. And not someday, today, right here, right now. You get to begin again. You get to remember who you are beneath all the noise. You get to return, not to who you were told to be, but to the deep, calm awareness that's been quietly watching all along. So as we begin this journey together, I ask you to open not just your ears, but your heart, because what we're about to explore isn't just philosophy. It's a return to your natural state. It's a quiet revolution. It's the art of becoming untouchable in the best possible way. And it all begins with a single question. What if nothing and no one could affect you ever again? Let's find out. Do you ever feel like you're not living life? You're just reacting to it. Someone says something cruel, you take it personally. They forget to reply, you feel unwanted. They look at you the wrong way, you overthink it all night. Like a puppet, your mood rises and falls, pulled by strings you didn't even know were attached to you. And here's the truth most of us don't want to admit. We've surrendered our peace to every passing emotion. We've become emotional puppets, strings pulled by what others say, or don't say, by how many likes we get, by how loudly the world applauds or how silently it ignores us. Someone frowns, you feel anxious. They praise you, you're elated. They ghost you, you're shattered. They admire you, you feel worthy. But let's pause for a moment. Who's really in control here? Is it you? Or have you handed the reins of your well-being to everything outside of you? In Buddhism, this is called ch letter 1ea5p th letter 1e7, grasping, clinging, not just to possessions, but to how things should be, to how people should treat you, to how life should unfold. And when reality doesn't match your script, you suffer, you feel betrayed, disappointed, unseen, unloved. But maybe the betrayal never came from them. Maybe it came from within when you decided that your peace depended on their behavior. Let me share something personal. Years ago, I worked in a place where every compliment felt like a gold coin, and every criticism felt like a dagger. If my boss smiled, I felt safe. If they were quiet, I spiraled. If a friend replied late, I questioned my worth. If someone unfollowed me, I questioned my identity. I wasn't living. I was reacting, all day, every day. I'd go home emotionally exhausted, not because life was hard, but because I was chasing approval like oxygen. And one day during meditation, something shifted. A simple line floated into my awareness. You are not a puppet, unless you keep acting like one. I realized I had tied my sense of self to invisible strings. People's moods, their words, their reactions, and none of those were ever mine to control. That day I started cutting those strings, one by one, not because I stopped caring, but because I started caring about the right things. I stopped overanalyzing every silence. I stopped apologizing for my feelings. I stopped needing to be liked in order to feel enough. And slowly, the puppet became a person again, a presence, a stillness, unshaken by every wind that once bent me. The Buddha once said, "Praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain come and go like the wind. To be happy, rest like a great tree in the midst of them all." Let that image sit with you. A tree still, rooted, unbothered. When someone insults it, it stays. When someone praises it, it stays. When the wind howls, it sways, but it does not break. So ask yourself, how much of your daily energy is spent reacting to things outside of you? How often do you lose your peace over someone else's opinion? How often do you forget who you are just to be accepted? And more importantly, what would change if you stopped letting everything affect you? The truth is, you don't have to react to every word. You don't have to chase validation. You don't have to explain yourself to people who have already made up their minds. You can observe and choose not to engage. You can feel the sting of criticism and let it float away like a cloud. You can hear silence and not assign it meaning. You can watch others perform and no longer feel the need to join the play. Because freedom isn't found in control, it's found in release. And when you finally let go of the need to react, defend, explain, perform, you return to the most powerful place of all, your center, the calm in the storm, the watcher of the waves, the space where no one and nothing can shake you. You stop being the puppet, and you become the sky. Let me ask you something. When you wake up in the morning, before your feet even touch the ground, do you already feel heavy? I'm not talking about physical exhaustion. I'm talking about the invisible weight that sits on your chest before the day even begins. The silent pressure behind your eyes, the tension in your jaw before you've spoken a single word. Have you ever stopped and asked, what exactly am I carrying? Because here's a truth that few dare to speak. You are probably carrying things that were never yours to begin with. You're carrying the weight of expectations placed on you by family, the burden of perfection fed to you by media, the scars of past regrets, the anxiety of a future you cannot control, and the ghost of every version of you that didn't succeed. You carry other people's opinions, their judgments, their silence, their misunderstandings, and without realizing it, you've become like a traveler dragging around a suitcase full of bricks, wondering why the journey feels so heavy, so joyless, so exhausting. But here's the question Buddhism asks gently again and again. Is this mine to carry? Pause. Let that question echo in you. That need to be liked by everyone. Is that yours? Or was it installed by a society that profits off your insecurity? That pressure to succeed at all costs. Is that yours? Or was it handed to you by a culture that mistakes productivity for worth? That story that you're not enough unless you look a certain way, live a certain lifestyle, hit a certain milestone. Is that truly yours? Or were you hypnotized into believing it? Buddhism calls this upadana, grasping at identity, at stories, at roles. We accumulate these attachments like emotional debris and we cling to them as if they define us. But they don't. Let me share a story. Two monks were traveling together. As they came to a river, they saw a young woman, unable to cross because of the strong current. Without hesitation, the older monk picked her up and carried her across. Hours later, the younger monk, clearly disturbed, finally spoke. "How could you carry her? We're monks. We're not supposed to even touch women." The elder monk smiled and said, "I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" That is the question for you today. What are you still carrying that you should have set down hours ago? A conversation from 5 years ago. A rejection that still echoes. A version of yourself that no longer exists. We carry so much, not because we must, but because we never questioned if we could release it. In fact, society doesn't teach us to let go. It teaches us to accumulate achievements, opinions, status, guilt. The result? We end up like overpacked suitcases, barely functioning, always on the edge of snapping. But Buddhism offers a gentle rebellion. Empty your bag, unburden your soul, return to lightness. Because peace doesn't come from carrying everything. It comes from carrying only what truly matters. And the only things truly worth carrying: compassion, clarity, truth, presence. Everything else, let it go. The Buddha didn't walk around with gold or titles. He walked barefoot under trees with a bowl and robes. Not because poverty is noble, but because freedom is. The less you carry, the further you can walk. So how do you begin to put down the invisible weights? Step 1, awareness. Just noticing what you're holding without judgment. Step 2, discernment. Ask yourself gently, does this serve my peace? If the answer is no, set it down without guilt, without apology. You don't owe your energy to every opinion. You don't owe your time to every demand. You don't owe your suffering to your past. Step 3, practice sacred pauses. Throughout the day, stop and check in with yourself. Am I carrying something that isn't mine? Did I pick up someone else's emotion? What can I release before I move forward? This simple practice alone can change your life, because the world will never stop handing you weights, but you get to decide which ones you hold on to. Today, choose lightness. Let go of the identity you've outgrown. Lay down the fear that was never yours. Release the pressure to be anything other than who you are right now. You don't have to carry everything. Just carry what brings you home to yourself. Because in that space, that open, uncluttered, weightless space, peace begins to breathe. Let me ask you something personal. How often do you find yourself trying to fix everything? Every problem, every conversation, every outcome. You send the text, then you wait, and check your phone 10 more times, just to feel in control. You plan your week to the minute. You rehearse future conversations in your head. You analyze everything someone said just to feel safe. But beneath all that control, isn't there just fear? Fear that if you don't control, something will collapse. Someone will leave, you'll fail, you'll be forgotten. It's exhausting, isn't it? And here's the hard truth Buddhism invites us to consider. Control is an illusion. You can prepare, you can plan, you can try your best, but you can't predict how others will act. You can't force someone to stay. You can't bend time or fate or the universe to your will. And the more you try to, the more you suffer. Because what you're really trying to control is your own discomfort with uncertainty. Let that sink in. You're not trying to control life. You're trying to avoid the feeling of not being in control. But life was never meant to be controlled. It's not a machine. It's not a formula. It's a river. And the more you try to grip it, the more it slips through your fingers. One day, the Buddha told his disciples a story. A man was stranded on one side of a river. To cross it, he built a raft out of branches and vines. He paddled hard and reached the other side safely. But once he arrived, he wondered, "This raft has served me well. Should I carry it on my back in case I need it again?" The Buddha smiled. Would it make sense to carry it on dry land? No one replied. He continued, "Just like the raft, even helpful tools must be left behind when they are no longer useful. Even good things must be let go." And what if control is that raft? It helped you survive. It gave you structure. It gave you certainty in moments of chaos. But maybe now it's become your burden. You're not moving freely anymore. You're carrying the raft through the forest, through your job, your marriage, your goals, your health. You're trying to control everything and everyone. And you wonder why life feels so tight. But that's what Zen teaches. You can't control the river, but you can learn to float. Let that line live inside you. You can't control the river, but you can learn to float. You don't need to predict the future. You don't need to fix every misunderstanding. You don't need to cling to what's slipping away. Sometimes, the greatest peace comes not from solving, but from surrendering. Think about how much of your life is spent fighting with reality, arguing with what's already happened, resisting what you can't change, forcing what no longer fits. It's like yelling at the rain for falling, or scolding the wind for blowing. And in that struggle we become bitter, rigid, tired, small. But when you finally stop fighting, when you accept that you're not in charge, something magical happens. You begin to flow, you laugh more, you breathe deeper. You stop controlling people and start connecting with them. You stop demanding answers and start trusting your path. You become like water, clear, adaptable, strong but soft, resilient but unattached. And here's the deeper truth. You were never meant to carry the universe. You were only meant to dance with it. So today, ask yourself, what am I gripping too tightly? Where am I forcing life instead of flowing with it? What might open up if I let go just a little? Because the moment you release the illusion of control, you return to what is real, the breath, the present, the peace of allowing. And in that peace, you'll discover something the world could never give you. Trust not in outcomes, but in yourself, in your ability to ride the wave no matter where it leads. So let go of the rope, stop paddling upstream, and just float. Imagine a glass of muddy water. You shake it, stir it, swirl it around. What do you see? Nothing. Only confusion, murky chaos. But if you place that glass down and leave it still, what happens? Eventually the dirt settles. The water clears, and what was once cloudy becomes transparent. That glass is your mind, and the constant stirring. That's your overthinking, your reacting, your need to control, fix, explain, defend. Most people live like this, like a constantly shaken glass of muddy water. They wake up already spinning, running to their phones, checking news, comments, texts, chasing stimulation, validation, distraction. They try to clear the water by stirring it faster. But all that does is make the mud rise again. In Buddhism, stillness is not weakness. It is not avoidance. It is awareness without reaction. The Buddha didn't sit in silence because he was passive. He sat because silence reveals what noise hides. Stillness is not absence. It is presence without chaos. And you've known this. Deep down, you've felt it. In the quiet moments, in nature, in prayer, in breath, but we forget. Because the world teaches us to stir, to perform, to chase, to prove our worth through constant motion. And so we stir and stir and stir, until we lose sight of ourselves. Let me share a story from my early practice. Years ago, I used to meditate in a small, candle-lit room at 5 a.m. At first, every session felt like a war. Thoughts kept rushing in. Memories, regrets, to-do lists, fantasies. I tried to push them away. I'd tell myself, be calm, be still, focus, let go. But the harder I tried, the louder everything became. Then one day, my teacher said something simple. You don't stop the mud by scooping it. You stop it by leaving it alone. That was the turning point. I stopped fighting the thoughts, and I started watching them. Like clouds drifting across the sky, I didn't chase them, I didn't fear them, I just observed. And that's when the stillness came, not as something I created, but as something that was always there. Underneath the noise. Now I know this sounds dangerous. Stop caring, won't I become lazy, numb, apathetic? But in Buddhism, to stop caring doesn't mean indifference. It means discernment. It means you stop giving your attention to what doesn't serve you. You stop reacting to what doesn't matter. You stop exhausting yourself on the stage of public opinion. Because peace doesn't come from fixing the world. It comes from stillness within the world. When you stop stirring the muddy water, you begin to see, that not every comment needs a response. That not every emotion needs a solution. That not every thought deserves your belief. And in that stillness, truth begins to emerge. You stop chasing meaning, and you start becoming it. You stop trying to find yourself in other people, and you realize you were never lost. You were just loud inside. So how do you practice this stillness? Not by moving to the mountains, not by escaping life, but by weaving small sacred pauses into your day. When brushing your teeth, feel the bristles. When drinking tea, truly taste the warmth. When walking, hear your footsteps. These are not empty rituals. These are doors back to presence. The Zen tradition teaches, when you eat, eat. When you walk, walk. When you sit, just sit. Do not multitask your way through existence. Be here, now, fully. That is stillness. So many people confuse their thoughts with their truth. But your thoughts are just weather, clouds, passing fog. The mud in the water is not the water itself. The emotion is not your identity. The pain is not your personhood. You are not the disturbance. You are the awareness beneath it. And once you realize that, the mud no longer defines you. The noise no longer owns you. You become the watcher, the witness, the calm beneath the chaos. So today, I invite you to stop stirring. Just stop. Let the mind settle. Let the emotions rise and fall. Let life unfold without your grip. And in that letting go, you'll meet someone you may have forgotten. Yourself, the quiet, clear, loving self, who doesn't need approval, who doesn't need to fix everything, who already is whole. And that self, that stillness, it was never far away. It was waiting right under the surface all this time. Close your eyes for a moment. Bring your hands into gentle fists. Now squeeze, squeeze tighter, keep squeezing. Feel the tension, the pain, the resistance. That's what attachment feels like. And you may not realize it, but most of us live with our fists clenched, clinging to people, to plans, to pasts, to futures. We hold on because it gives us a sense of identity. We hold on because we think it keeps us safe. But here's the paradox. The tighter we hold, the more we suffer. The more we cling, the more it slips away. Imagine this. You're holding a beautiful rose. It smells divine. It looks perfect. But the thorns begin to pierce your skin. Still, you don't let go, you hold on tighter. Why? Because you're afraid of losing it. You say, this rose is too important, too rare, too mine. But your hand is bleeding, and every moment you hold it, you are hurting. This is how we hold on to relationships that no longer nurture us, expectations that were never realistic, guilt over mistakes already forgiven, identities that we've long outgrown, and we wonder, why am I so exhausted? Why do I feel so trapped? It asks you to stop clinging. There's a difference. Love says, I honor this moment, I cherish this person. Clinging says, this must stay forever or I will break. But nothing in life stays forever. The Buddha taught that everything conditioned is impermanent. People change, seasons turn, emotions rise and fall. To cling is to go to war with reality. To let go is to move in harmony with life. Let me share a story from the Buddha's time. One day, a grieving mother brought the body of her dead child to the Buddha. Her name was Kisa Gautami. She begged him to bring her child back to life. The Buddha said, yes, I can help, but first bring me a mustard seed from a house where no one has ever known loss. She went from door to door. Every household had lost someone, a father, a mother, a sister, a son. By the end of the day, she returned empty-handed. That's when she understood. She was not alone in her pain. Loss is not personal, it is universal. And in that moment of surrender, she buried her child, sat down, and began to walk the path of awakening. You see, letting go doesn't mean you forget. It means you stop resisting what is. Letting go isn't giving up. It's giving yourself permission to heal. It's saying, this story no longer serves me. This version of me is complete. This fear no longer has a seat at my table. It's like releasing a bird that's been sitting in your hands. You loved it. You held it gently. But now it's time to let it fly. And in doing so, you free yourself. What am I holding too tightly? Is it your need to always be understood? Is it your belief that you must succeed by a certain age? Is it a friendship you've outgrown but don't want to release? Is it a self-image that no longer matches your soul? Every time you ask this question, you begin to loosen your grip. You begin to breathe again. Because the real suffering doesn't come from loss, it comes from resistance. The pain of heartbreak is real, but the suffering comes when you say, this should not have happened. But it did. It is. And your freedom begins the moment you stop arguing with that truth. You don't need to force yourself to let go all at once. That's not how the heart works. Letting go happens gently, like leaves falling in autumn. One by one. Start small. Let go of needing to respond to every message. Let go of being the one who always fixes everything. Let go of the story that healing must be fast. Just start. Because every small release creates space for something greater. Clarity, peace, space, self-trust. Love that's not based on fear. You realize that nothing real is ever lost, only transformed. And in the great silence that follows surrender, you meet a version of yourself that doesn't need to chase, perform, or prove. A self that trusts life, a self that flows. So today, just ask yourself, what am I holding too tightly? And then whisper, it's okay to let go now. You've carried it long enough. You've squeezed for too long. Your hands are tired. Your soul is ready. Let go, not because it doesn't matter, but because your peace matters more. And in that letting go, you don't lose control, you gain your freedom. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed too long? Too long in a conversation that drained you? Too long in a job that numbed you? Too long in a relationship that no longer saw you? You told yourself to be patient. You tried to fix it. You explained, justified, compromised, endured. And yet deep down, you knew, you felt it in your body. The fatigue, the shrinking, the slow erosion of joy, but you stayed because walking away felt like failure. because silence felt like abandonment, because leaving without a storm seemed too empty. But here's what Buddhism invites us to remember. Not every fire is yours to put out. Not every room deserves your presence. Not every bond must last forever. Sometimes the highest wisdom is not in arguing but in exiting. Not loudly, not with blame but calmly, like a breeze closing a door. We live in a world that glorifies grand gestures. We think closure requires explanation. We believe strength means confrontation. But what if it does? What if real power is walking away without bitterness, without defending your side of the story? What if you simply left? No need to burn bridges. No need to prove your pain. No need to teach them a lesson. You just outgrew the space, and you chose peace over performance. This is the calm exit. We don't stay because we're weak. We stay because we care, because we believe in trying, because we're taught that endurance is noble. But what no one tells you is, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and others is to leave when your light is dimming, when your truth is silenced, when your energy is constantly drained. You don't owe anyone your depletion. You don't have to destroy anything, but you do have the right to disappear quietly for your own healing, and that isn't selfish. That's sacred self-respect. In Zen, there is a simple teaching. A master once poured tea for a student. He kept pouring even when the cup overflowed. The student shouted, "Stop, it's full." The master smiled and said, "Exactly, you are like this cup. You're too full to receive anything new. Sometimes you must empty yourself first." Staying in spaces where you're overfilled with stress, noise, resentment, it leaves no room for clarity. But walking away, that's how you empty the cup. That's how you begin again. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't need a final speech. It doesn't require a dramatic goodbye. Just leave with softness, with breath, with love, especially for yourself. Because walking away in silence is not suppression. It is surrender without collapse. You are saying, "This no longer aligns with me. I release this space with gratitude. I choose peace over chaos." And when you do this, you stop carrying battles that were never yours. Sometimes the other person will not understand. They may question. They may blame. They may call you selfish or cold. That is their storm, not your responsibility. As Buddhism teaches, your peace is your practice. Their reaction is their karma. Let them feel what they must. You don't need to carry it. You don't owe the world an explanation for choosing your mental clarity. When you walk away in silence, you're not escaping, you're reclaiming, you're telling yourself, "I deserve a life that feels whole. I don't have to stay to be good. My worth isn't measured by how long I tolerate pain." And in that space of absence, healing begins. You start to hear yourself again. Your voice returns. Your energy rises. And your center, your beautiful center, becomes clear once more. So today, ask yourself, what am I staying in out of guilt, not growth? What am I explaining that no longer needs words? And can I simply walk away, not in anger, not in fear, but in stillness? Because the exit doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes the most transformational move is the quietest one. You don't need permission to protect your soul. You don't need a perfect reason to rest. You don't need applause for walking away from what hurts. You only need one thing. Clarity that your energy is sacred, that your presence is a gift, that your life deserves stillness. And with that, you turn the knob, you step outside, you walk away. Not with rage, but with reverence, because the chapter is done. And peace is the page that follows. You've been standing in front of the same door for years, pushing, pulling, knocking, begging it to open. This must change. I have to fix this. I'll be happy when. But what if I told you the door was never locked? What if the barrier you've been fighting was never outside of you, but within. In Buddhist psychology, radical acceptance means this: to stop resisting what is, to stop demanding that life be different, to stop arguing with the present moment. It doesn't mean you like what's happening. It doesn't mean you approve, but it means you finally see it clearly without resistance. And that clarity is freedom. Let me ask you, what pain are you still waiting to undo? What part of your life are you still trying to fix? What storm do you keep trying to outrun? Most people spend their lives treating life like a broken machine, always needing repair, always waiting for the next update, the next fix, the next breakthrough. But Buddhism offers a different invitation. What if nothing needs to change right now? What if this is not a mistake, but your path? You are not suffering because life is painful. You are suffering because you believe it shouldn't be this way. I can't accept this. This moment is wrong. But life isn't personal. It flows, it moves, it transforms. You suffer when you resist its current. You find peace when you flow with it. It's like sitting in a boat on a river, thrashing at the water, trying to paddle upstream, when the river was always meant to carry you downstream. The current isn't against you. It's your resistance that tires you. A Zen monk once sat before a door every day meditating. For years he would cry and whisper, "Please let me in. Let me see the truth. Let me be free." One day, exhausted and broken, he stopped begging, he stopped knocking, he simply sat, and in that silence, he realized there was no lock. There never was. The door was already open. He had just never tried walking through without force. Ask yourself, what am I trying to control that is outside my hands? What truth am I unwilling to face? What feeling am I resisting, hoping it will disappear? What if, instead of fighting sadness, you sat with it like an old friend? What if, instead of denying fear, you bowed to it with compassion? What if, instead of changing the moment, you allowed it to be exactly as it is? Radical acceptance is not passivity. It is power without struggle. It's saying, I don't like this, but I accept it. I feel afraid, and that's okay. This is painful, but I choose to be present with it. And here's the secret: what you accept fully begins to transform. Because the moment you stop resisting, you release the tension that keeps the wound open. Because we confuse it with giving up, but they are not the same. Giving up says, I quit, I surrender to despair. Radical acceptance says, I see clearly, I choose peace over control. It is the difference between being crushed by the wave and surfing it with grace. It's not resignation, it's alignment with life, with impermanence, with truth. You may think you need to earn peace, deserve joy, fix everything before you're allowed to rest. But the door to your inner temple was never locked. You were just too busy struggling to see that it was already ajar. That freedom isn't at the end of your efforts, it's at the end of resistance. Today, sit down, right where you are, close your eyes, and whisper to yourself, this is what's happening. I will meet it with calm. I will walk through the door as I am. No more waiting, no more pushing, no more fixing everything before you allow yourself peace. Because peace is not a reward, it is your nature. You've been standing in the open doorway of your own soul. You were always free to walk through. And now, you can. When was the last time you said yes? When your heart was screaming no? When you smiled through discomfort, agreed out of fear, stayed quiet to avoid disappointing someone? You thought you were being kind. You thought you were avoiding conflict. You thought you were strong, but inside something small and sacred shrank. Buddhist teachings speak endlessly of compassion, but here's what most people miss. Compassion is not sacrifice. Compassion is balance. Compassion is clarity. When you say yes to everything and everyone, even at the cost of your well-being, that is not love. That is depletion. That is abandoning yourself in the name of pleasing others, and there is nothing compassionate about running on empty. Boundaries do not separate us, they connect us honestly. When you say, "No, I can't take on more right now. No, this space is sacred to me. No, I need to rest," you are not rejecting others, you are embracing yourself. You're telling the world, "This is where my truth lives, please honor it, and if you can't, I will." Let me share a real story. A Buddhist teacher I once met used to offer free meditation sessions every evening. At first, he welcomed everyone, anytime, any day, for any reason. But slowly his health began to suffer. His joy faded. He became resentful of his own practice. Then one day he quietly posted a sign, "The temple is open, but the teacher is not always available. Honor the silence, respect the space." He didn't explain further. He didn't apologize, and something magical happened. People respected him more. He had space to rest, and his teachings deepened. Sometimes the most loving thing you can say is no. You don't have to justify, you don't need an excuse. You don't owe a performance of guilt. Try it. "No, I can't." "No, thank you. Not today." And then stop. Let the silence hold. The world might be uncomfortable at first, but that is not your burden to carry. As Buddhist wisdom teaches, let others carry their own karma. Your job is to protect your peace. When someone asks of you, pause. Ask yourself, am I doing this out of joy or out of fear? Is this a gift or a performance? Will I feel peace after saying yes or regret? If the answer is not rooted in peace, then the answer is no. Set the boundary calmly, with a soft voice, with a steady heart. I care about you, but I need this time for myself. I understand, but I can't give that energy right now. I'm choosing rest today. Then stop talking. Let the boundary do its work. Think of your soul as a sacred temple. You would never allow just anyone to walk in with muddy shoes, loud voices, and chaos. You would protect that space. You would say, "Please remove your shoes, speak softly here." That's how you must protect your mind. Your time, your spirit. Block off a few hours each week. No phone, no favors, no obligation, just you. Breathing, realigning, returning to your center. That is your temple. That is your sacred no. You are not here to be liked by everyone. You are not here to absorb everyone's burdens. You are not here to be everything for everyone. You are here to walk the path of truth, and truth begins with saying, "Not this. Not now. No more." Every time you say no to what depletes you, you say yes to inner peace, emotional honesty, energy for what really matters, a life that reflects your values. You create space for the real you to show up. Not the people pleaser, not the fixer, not the apologizer. The present whole sovereign you. So today, practice this simple mantra. I am not here to please everyone. I am here to live aligned. I say no when my soul says no. Because your no is not rejection, it's redirection. It's remembrance, it's respect. And that, dear one, is compassion in its purest form. You are not your pain, you are not your past. You are not your fears or failures, you are not even your thoughts. You are the sky, vast, open, untouched, and all the storms of life are just passing weather. The rain falls, the wind howls. The clouds gather thick and heavy, but behind it all, still expansive, unmoved, is the sky. That's who you are. Somewhere along the journey, you began to believe you were the thunder, the fear, the anxiety, the chaos. You wrapped your identity around moments of suffering and called them me. But in Buddhist wisdom, suffering is not who you are. It's something you experience. It's something you can observe. And when observed, it begins to dissolve. Because the moment you stop identifying with the storm, you return to your true nature, the witness, the stillness, the vast blue sky, even when your mind is loud, even when your heart is heavy. even when your life feels like it's unraveling. The sky has not disappeared, it's just momentarily hidden, no matter how many storms pass through your life. You are never broken, you are never lost, you are simply clouded. But clouds don't stain the sky. They move, they change, they dissolve, and the sky remains. So the next time life feels too much, close your eyes, feel your breath, and remember, you are not here to chase clouds. You are here to return to your sky. There's nothing to fix, nothing to control, nothing to become, just this moment, just this breath, just this space of being. You don't have to search for peace. You don't have to earn stillness. You don't have to prove your worth. All that is required is that you stop chasing and start remembering. Remember who you are. When all the noise fades, remember the sky, return to the sky, be the sky. If something in today's reflection touched your heart, if even for a moment you felt seen, or still, or whole, then perhaps it's time to walk this path a little deeper. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more gentle reminders, ancient teachings, and quiet spaces where your soul can breathe. You don't have to figure it all out today. You just have to keep returning to presence, to peace, to the sky within you. Until next time, walk gently, live mindfully, and let the storms pass.